when I read these statements, right, these statements against some certain injustice, I'm very attuned to, are they soft pedaling something? Are they reading, are they writing with the white gaze and fearful of, well, if I say it this way, are white Christians gonna react this way or whatever? There was none of that in this statement. It was straightforward. It was concise, right? Like these things can go on forever, but this was concise. My favorite paragraph is a very painful one, which is about the pattern of anti-Asian racism and giving those historical examples. Man, I'm just waiting like for the weekend when I can go to each of those events, look them up, and learn more about it, and try to educate myself about some of the history there too. If you think of like whiteness as concentric circles with sort of European whites in the center, and then because whiteness is inherently anti-black, it creates this category of blackness that they're against, tend to be in the outermost concentric circle, but you can still move closer to that center circle. You're never quite white, right? You never quite are part of that, but if you're light skinned, if you're educated, etc., you can move closer to the center and then get the advantages and privileges of being closer to the center. And that's what I observed from afar, is that, when you come in uh, to United States culture and society, you can choose, you can choose whether to what degree you want to sort of assimilate or play the game and move closer to the center, or do you want to sort of stand with the marginalized? Now, for Black folks, especially darker skinned Black folks, there's only so far you can go, unless you're extremely talented, like, a LeBron James or something like that. But thankfully, he's maintained some solidarity with the Black community. But for other folks, especially who aren't of African descent, what I observed is like a lot of Asian folks who I knew, um, I don't know how to say it, but it's almost like trading up, right? Like if you associate with white people, adopt language and expectations, then you get certain advantages, but you had no advantage by associating with Black people.
And I totally agree with that. Sociologists call that white adjacency. So those who benefit from being near whiteness, which, I mean, Asian Americans, because of our own immigrant experience and because of the racism that we experienced early on, our parents, I mean, my parents told me, because I'm second generation Korean American, my parents told me, hey, on Monday to Friday, do your best not to be Korean when you go to school, because you're going to get made fun of, you're going to get picked on, you're going to get bullied. And they would have me go play hockey. And I'm like, that is one
Wow.
of the ways I was colonized. Now I love hockey still, and I'm like, don't hold that
Yeah.
against me. I'm a hardcore Blackhawks and LA Kings fan. But
Oh,
I'm
that's
like,
what's up.
yeah.
I'm from near Chicago, so that's cool.
But I mean, that's part of
We
the
might need to
reality.
change the mascots though.
That's right.
That's right. That's right. And I was just reading about the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, and man, it's a brutal history of Asians coming to the United States in general, the Chinese in particular on the West Coast, and Japanese as well. But it's a history that we really don't know very well. I mean, as as much as I lament how little sort of Black history that we know, at the same time, there's so little Asian history that we know of our regions. In the Black American experience, we've had like the Black Power movement in the late 60s and 70s. We've had the Black Lives Matter movement more recently. And what these movements, what I think have done, is made it to be sort of Black and proud and out loud, right? Like it's sort of pushing back against that we have anything to downplay or fear or whatever because of our racial identity. And I'm wondering, is there a moment like that or a movement like that for Asian Americans?
Yeah, actually, there was I believe it was in the 80s or nine. I don't remember the exact year. Vincent Chin was killed by people. So he was a Chinese American auto worker in Michigan, in the Detroit area, I believe. And he was at a bar, I think, with his dad, just drinking. and a couple of white auto workers looked over at him, and because the Japanese car market and car industry was growing, they looked towards him and was like, oh my gosh, and they started using Japanese slurs to address him, even though he was Chinese, right? Because in the racialized imagination, if any one ethnicity that's Asian is considered bad or evil, all of us are considered evil, and that particular ethnicity. Which is why when I was growing up, nobody knew what Korean was. They always said I was either Chinese or Japanese, and then they would use that, Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, look at these. And I'm like, no, I'm Korean. And it's only because of the major push of Korean K-pop and Hallyu and Korean dramas and all the things that are coming out of Korea, that we are now in the imaginary of kind of the Western and the global society. And so and sociologists will talk about how media plays such a significant role in shaping our own racialized lenses. And so the murder, and so what ended up happening with Vincent was they started calling him names, and they were apparently making fun of him, and it was just a joke, right? Because racism towards Asians always starts as a joke, and we get targeted in that way. And you'll even hear preachers go, I'm going to speak in tongues, and go, want to buy a Honda, Kawasaki Mitsubishi. And you're like, no, that's actually kind of racist. Like that's not okay. And they think they're being funny, but like what they're doing is they're oppressing our languages and our and kind of what we're bringing from our own kind of ethnic background, and kind of utilizing it for their own gain or for their own kind of humor. And so they basically took him outside, and then they blundered him to death, Vincent Chin. And that was like one of the major rallying moments across the Asian American landscape. And this is still like, it was major, but it wasn't like as broad as something like the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Because Christians are in that, whether they agree with all of the kind of positions of all the different people within the Black Lives Matter movement, because at the core, it's essentially saying we believe that every person and every Black person has inherent dignity and worth in the eyes of God, right? And so there's no one that can oppose that. And so that was a big kind of a push where Asian Americans from different ethnic backgrounds came together to protest and to participate in activism. But there hasn't been much. When the Japanese mass incarceration took place, I mean, every other Asian was trying to make sure that they weren't considered Japanese, right? So we distanced ourselves from the Japanese people because we didn't want to get thrown into an incarceration camp. I mean, who wants to go to a concentration camp? Nobody.
Exactly.
And so what we should have done, and what our forefathers, and they had circumstances that prevented them from doing that too, because they knew that if whiteness targeted them and white supremacy targeted them, they would have been thrown into those concentration camps. And so it was a catch-22, a lose-lose situation for everybody. And one of the things I've been realizing, because I went to LA and read through some of the kind of sermons that people were preaching, the Japanese pastors were preaching during the time of the incarceration. And the weekend before, everyone was leaving, at least of the sermons that I've seen. So I haven't seen all the sermons because I've got a whole stack of them that I'm trying to look at. But the ones I've seen so far have basically said and cited Romans 13 over and over and over again. And then this trust that God is with you in exile as you go to concentration camps. But at the same time, you are called to obey the government, which the government just 15 to 20 years later, because they had more representation from the Japanese community and the Asian American community more broadly, said, no, that was an illegal act. We committed a crime as a government, and then basically paid each family under the Reagan administration $20,000, for many of whom lost everything. And so so people who had farms, all of that was gone with overnight. People took their land, and when they got back, they had nothing left. No one was there to tend to their farms. I mean, you have some amazing stories of those who were working on the farms that stayed and kind of cultivated the land and took care of it. But overall, I mean, there was a significant amount of wealth that was lost. And one of the things that they learned is there was a group that said, we have to really put our heads down and just fit into society. And then another group, a far smaller group of Japanese Americans that said, we can never let this happen again. They took cues from the Holocaust and the Jews in Nazi Germany that said never again. And so even at 9/11, when there was a targeting for of Middle Eastern Americans and Muslim Americans, you would see a lot of these Japanese Americans who were looking back at their own history say, it's happening all over again. We got to stop this where it can. But sadly, even then, there wasn't a broad coalition of Asian Americans, especially Asian Christians. I didn't really learn anything about Asian American history. And the only thing I really learned about African American history was that, one, there was slavery, two, there was a civil rights movement, and three, everything is okay now.
It's okay now. Racism is over.
That's right. We are a post-racial society where nobody sees skin color.
So this is the thing that constantly baffles me. I was, in the past year, I've been trying to be intentional about developing relationships with people of Asian descent. And one of the things that spurred it was this infographic that breaks up people into a 100 friend scenario. And they do it mainly with the average white American and the average Black American. And so for the average white American, they have 91 white friends out of 100, and then one each of a Black, Latino, Asian, mixed race, other race friend, and then 3 friends who they don't know the race of. So basically, 9 out of 10 friends for white people is white. Then they did the same thing for the average Black American. It turns out that we have 83 Black friends, so about 8 out of 10. We have 8 white friends, though, which is 8 times the amount of Black friends that a white person has. So we have a lot more exposure to white people than white people do to Black people. We have 2 Latino friends, 3 mixed race friends, 1 friend of another race, and then 4 friends of an unknown race. The only one that we average 0 friends is Asian. So the average Black American has 0 Asian friends. And when I looked at that, I was like, well, it's going to be hard to be about this racial justice thing and about reconciliation if I've got, no people from, Asian descent. Racism has a very simple playbook, and it uses it for every person of color, basically, with some slight variation. But I think we can find a lot of commonality and even strength in learning one another's experiences. So to any Black folks out there who might listen to this, like, we got to be really intentional about developing meaningful relationships with our Asian American brothers and sisters.
I wish that I had learned about the Black experience in America when I was in elementary school. I think it would have deepened my spirituality, because it would have helped me to see things with the eyes that God wants me to see the world in. And so talking to your kids, I mean, I know that there's already one resource on our website for how to talk to your kids about anti-Asian racism in your schools. But I mean, there are people that are doing the educating work, and we just don't have all those resources accessible. And so people are just kind of creating things on their own. And so we're hoping that what we're doing becomes a depository for all that. And then I think in the future, just continuing to produce Asian American theological resources, preaching resources, pastoral resources, leadership resources. But then in terms of solidarity, I think that, we have to acknowledge that even like for Asian Americans, that putting our own names on a document isn't a high cost. What comes after is what really matters. And so whether we stay at the table with one another and like actually cultivate friendships, and the church is actually, in my opinion, the church in America, though we have some bright spots, are perpetuating the damage that we're seeing more and more. And so I think one of the things that we have to do, and this would probably be a call for our white brothers and sisters in Christ, is learn to be the minority. It's okay. I mean, you're not gonna die. We operate in your spaces all the time, and we love you in those spaces, and our presence in those spaces are hopefully there to encourage you, even though we push against some of the thinking that you were raised in. But I would love to see that